I threw my cheating wife out of the house after discovering her betrayal in my car. The phrase echoed in Ethan's mind as he watched Sarah, his wife, walk out the door for the last time. Her face, a blend of anger and sorrow, would be etched in his memory forever. But in that moment, he felt nothing but a calculated coldness. Her betrayal was the final straw. Ethan had always been a man of principle. He grew up in a small town in Colorado, where honor and family were everything. He met Sarah in college, and from then on, she became the center of his world. They built a life together, filled with dreams and promises. But it all crumbled the night he found the messages on her phone. At first, he tried to deny the reality, chalking the messages up to a misunderstanding. But the evidence was too clear to ignore. The texts, the calls, the secret meetings. Everything pointed to one undeniable truth: Sarah was cheating on him. Determined to confront her, Ethan waited for the right moment. It came one evening when Sarah asked to use his car for a supposed night out with friends. Suspicious, Ethan installed a tracking device in the vehicle. The hours passed slowly until he saw the car stop at a secluded motel on the outskirts of town. Rage consumed him, and he decided to confront her. When he arrived, he saw Sarah exit the car and enter the motel with a man he recognized immediately: Greg, his best friend. The betrayal of his wife was painful enough, but the involvement of Greg was unbearable. Ethan waited, his heart racing, his mind swirling with thoughts of revenge. When Sarah returned to the car, Ethan was waiting. The shock on her face quickly turned to guilt. Without a word, he opened the car door and made her get in. The silence on the drive home was deafening. Her tears had no effect on him. Ethan was resolute. When they got home, he ordered her to pack her things and leave. Sarah tried to explain, tried to apologize, but Ethan didn't want to hear it. The only thing that mattered to him was the coldness of his revenge. And with one last devastated look, Sarah left the house that had once been their home. As the door closed, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Sarah and Greg's betrayal would not go unpunished. He was determined to seek justice, but on his own terms. And in that moment, a plan began to take shape in his mind: a cold, calculated, and devastating revenge. Ethan had grown up in Boulder, a vibrant city with a deep sense of community. From a young age, he learned the value of family and honor. His parents, hardworking and honest, instilled in him the importance of loyalty and respect. With these principles deeply rooted, Ethan excelled in school and later in his career as a lawyer. He was known for his integrity and dedication to his clients. It was at the University of Colorado where he met Sarah. She was a radiant young woman, with eyes that sparkled like emeralds and a smile that could light up any room. Sarah was studying psychology and always seemed to understand people, almost as if she could read their minds. Ethan fell head over heels in love, and before long, they were inseparable. Their wedding was like a fairy tale. A ceremony in a historic church, surrounded by friends and family, vows of eternal love exchanged under a perfect blue sky. Ethan and Sarah built a comfortable life, bought a cozy home in a quiet neighborhood, and began dreaming of a future filled with possibilities. But over time, Ethan began to notice subtle changes in Sarah. She became distant, often lost in thought, and her once passionate eyes now seemed dull and far away. Ethan tried to talk to her, but Sarah always had an excuse: work, stress, routine. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust her, but something inside him told him there was more to the story. The first concrete sign came unexpectedly. Ethan was leaving for work when he saw Sarah's phone vibrate on the kitchen counter. A message from Greg, his best friend, flashed on the screen: "Can't wait to see you tonight." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Greg and Sarah were close, but that message seemed too intimate. He decided not to mention it at the time, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Greg was more than a friend to Ethan, he was like a brother. They had known each other since childhood, shared secrets and adventures. When Ethan married Sarah, Greg was his best man, and the three of them were always inseparable. The thought of betrayal from two people he loved most was devastating. That night, Ethan barely slept. The image of Sarah and Greg together haunted him. He decided he needed concrete proof before taking any action. He installed a tracking app on Sarah's phone, something he never thought he'd do, but the need to know the truth was overpowering. The next few days were a mix of anxiety and vigilance. Ethan constantly checked the tracker, looking for any sign of suspicious behavior. Then, on a Friday night, Sarah said she was going out with friends to a new bar in town. With a heavy heart, Ethan wished her a good night and waited for her to leave. As soon as the door closed, he grabbed his phone and began monitoring her movements. To his horror, he saw that Sarah didn't go to the bar. Her car stopped at an unknown address, a motel on the outskirts of the city. Ethan felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over him. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and drove to the location. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Sarah and Greg were together, getting out of the car and entering the motel. Ethan stood there in the dark, watching the scene unfold. The pain of seeing his wife and best friend together was unbearable. But at the same time, a cold, calculated revenge began to form in his mind. He knew he needed to act, but he wanted to do it in a way that would cause the most damage. Ethan returned home and waited. When Sarah got back, he was sitting in the living room, his face expressionless. Without raising his voice, he confronted her. Sarah tried to deny it, but when Ethan showed her the evidence, she broke down in tears. He didn't want to hear explanations. The coldness he felt wouldn't allow it. He ordered her to pack her things and leave. Still crying, Sarah complied. As the door closed, Ethan knew this was only the first part of his revenge. Sarah and Greg's betrayal wouldn't go unpunished. He would spend the next few days planning every detail, every step. The pain he felt was transforming into a cold, calculated determination. And so, Ethan's journey toward a revenge he never imagined he was capable of began. In the quiet of his now empty house, Ethan looked at a wedding photo where he, Sarah, and Greg smiled happily. The irony of that image made him smile bitterly. The man he had been before the betrayal was disappearing, being replaced by someone colder, someone willing to do anything to get his revenge. And with that in mind, Ethan turned off the lights and began to outline the next steps of his cold and devastating plan. Ethan woke up the next day with a sense of emptiness, but also with a determination he hadn't felt in a long time. Sarah was out of his life, and now he could focus on what really mattered, revenge. But to do that, he needed information. He needed to understand what was going on in her mind and, more importantly, how to involve Greg in the plan. He began his day as if it were any other, trying to maintain normalcy while his plan unfolded in his mind. At the office, he buried himself in his cases, but his thoughts always drifted back to the betrayal. The pain was still intense, but he channeled it into building his revenge. During lunch, he met with Greg, who, as usual, asked about Sarah. "How's Sarah doing?" "I haven't seen her in a while," Greg said, with a look that Ethan now saw as insincere. "She's fine, just been busy with work. Actually, I'm thinking about taking a trip to clear my head. I need a break from everything." Greg nodded, but Ethan noticed a flicker of concern in his friend's eyes. They talked about trivial matters, but Ethan felt that every word was a chess move, where he carefully maneuvered his pieces. Later that night, Ethan began digging into Sarah's past. He went through her old diaries, looking for clues that might explain her behavior. That's when he found a hidden journal in the back of a drawer. In the yellowed pages, he discovered secrets Sarah had never shared with him. "Today was another one of those days. I feel lost, not knowing who I am. The emptiness inside me grows every day, and sometimes, the only way to silence it is by hurting myself or doing something to escape this numbness," Ethan read with a heavy heart. Sarah's words revealed a side of her he had never known, a side that struggled with inner demons. But this didn't lessen his anger. On the contrary, it gave him a new layer to explore in his revenge plan. The next day, Ethan decided to seek professional help to better understand what he was reading. He scheduled a consultation with a renowned psychologist, Dr. Anderson, and brought Sarah's journal with him. During the session, he listened carefully as the doctor analyzed the entries. "Your wife seems to be battling a serious psychological disorder, possibly borderline personality disorder. These self-destructive and impulsive actions are characteristic of the condition," Dr. Anderson explained. Ethan absorbed the information, but instead of feeling compassion, he felt even more determined. Now he knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to hurt both Sarah and Greg. He began to stage casual encounters where he could drop false hints about his trip and his emotional state. The following weekend, Ethan invited Greg over for a barbecue at his house. It was a pleasant afternoon, filled with laughter and memories. Ethan took the opportunity to plant seeds of doubt and guilt. "You know, Greg, I've been thinking a lot about my marriage. Sometimes, I wonder if I was the husband Sarah deserved. Maybe she was unhappy, and I never noticed," Ethan said, looking intently at Greg. "Don't say that, Ethan. You've always been a great husband." "Maybe she's just going through a rough patch," Greg replied, trying to hide his unease. Ethan noticed the tension in the air and decided to push a little further. "Sometimes, I feel like there are things about Sarah that I never really knew. Like she kept part of herself hidden from me. Maybe I should have been more attentive." Greg remained silent, fiddling with his drink, clearly uncomfortable. Ethan knew he was hitting a nerve. He spent the rest of the afternoon watching Greg's every reaction, mentally noting every sign of guilt. Days passed, and Ethan continued to refine his plan. He knew the key to success was getting Greg to crack. He used his skills as a lawyer to create a web of lies and false leads that made Greg believe Ethan was close to uncovering everything. Greg began avoiding Ethan, claiming he was busy with work, but Ethan knew it was fear. Fear of being caught. On a rainy night, Ethan received a call from Sarah. She wanted to talk, to ask for forgiveness, to explain herself. Ethan agreed to meet, but not because he wanted to hear her excuses. He wanted to use this opportunity to deepen his plan. They met at a secluded cafe. Sarah was visibly shaken, her eyes swollen from crying. Ethan kept a neutral expression as she spoke. "Ethan, I don't know where to start. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to understand that I'm sick. I've been battling these inner demons for years, and I never meant to hurt you." Ethan looked at her, feeling a mix of contempt and curiosity. "Sick? You mean cheating on your husband with his best friend is a sickness?" His voice was cold, calculated. Sarah began to cry again, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I know it sounds like an excuse, but I was so lost, so confused. Greg was. He was a mistake. A huge mistake. And now I've lost everything." Ethan leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "You haven't lost everything, Sarah. You're just starting to pay for what you did. And I'm going to make sure you and Greg understand the true meaning of betrayal." Sarah fell silent, frightened by Ethan's menacing tone. He stood up, leaving her there, lost in her thoughts. At that moment, he knew he was closer than ever to carrying out his revenge. The night was dark, and the rain poured down heavily, creating a symphony of raindrops on the windows of Ethan's home. He sat in his armchair, staring into the void, as the plan he had crafted over the past few days played out in his mind like a movie script. He decided it was time to confront Greg. He called him and, with a calm voice laced with hidden intentions, invited him for a talk. Greg, though reluctant, agreed to meet Ethan at the law office where he worked. The night was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Ethan arrived early at the office, preparing every detail. The lights were dim, creating a somber atmosphere. He placed a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses on the desk, waiting for Greg. When he finally arrived, drenched from the rain, Ethan greeted him with a cold smile. "Sit down, Greg. We have a lot to talk about," Ethan said, pointing to the chair across from his desk. Greg sat down, clearly uncomfortable. Ethan poured the whiskey and began to speak, his voice calm in contrast to the storm outside. "Greg, we've been friends for a long time. We've been through so much together. But now, everything seems like a lie." Ethan looked directly into Greg's eyes, waiting for a reaction. Greg avoided eye contact, fiddling with his whiskey glass. "Ethan, I don't know what to say. I feel terrible about all of this. I never wanted things to get this far." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "You and Sarah. How could you do this to me? You've destroyed my life, my trust, everything. And now, I need to understand why." Greg started talking, his voice trembling. "Sarah was going through a tough time. I was there for her, but I never wanted this to happen. It was a terrible mistake, and I regret it every day." Ethan listened in silence, letting Greg dig himself deeper. When he finished, Ethan got up and went to a drawer, from which he pulled out a folder. He threw it in front of Greg. "Do you know what this is? It's all the evidence I've collected on you two. Messages, photos, meetings. I could ruin you with this, but I want something more." Greg looked at the folder, pale. "What do you want, Ethan? What are you going to do?" Ethan leaned in, towering over the desk. "I want you to feel what I felt. I want you to lose everything you love, just like I did." Greg sat in silence, unsure of what to say. Ethan continued, his voice now colder. "You're going to help me destroy Sarah. She's weaker than ever, and I want her to pay for everything. And you're going to be my ally in this revenge." Greg tried to protest, but Ethan was relentless. "If you don't, these files go to the police, to your family, to everyone. Your life will fall apart." Realizing he had no choice, Greg agreed. Ethan smiled, satisfied. "Good. Let's get started." The following days were a whirlwind of actions and reactions. With Greg's reluctant help, Ethan began manipulating Sarah in ways she could never have anticipated. The first step was to further isolate Sarah. Ethan used the information from her diary to create situations that made her appear increasingly unstable. With Greg's help, they spread rumors about Sarah's erratic behavior. At work, she became seen as a problem, unstable. Her colleagues began avoiding her, and her professional life started to crumble. Ethan monitored every move, ensuring everything was going according to plan. One night, Ethan found Sarah at a bar, alone and desolate. He approached her, offering a helping hand, something she desperately needed. "Sarah, I know things are tough. I want to help you, even after everything. Let's talk." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, agreed. They talked for hours, Ethan pretending to be understanding while gathering more information. He discovered that she was taking heavy medication to control her emotional state, something he could use to his advantage. The next day, Ethan began spreading rumors that Sarah was using illicit drugs. With Greg embedded in her social circle, this quickly became fact. Before long, Sarah was called into her boss's office and suspended until the situation was clarified. Ethan knew he was on the right track. He continued to manipulate Greg, forcing him to do things against his will, but the fear of being exposed kept Greg in line. Ethan was getting closer to the climax of his plan, where the revelation would be devastating for everyone involved. Finally, the day of the big confrontation arrived. Ethan arranged a meeting with Sarah and Greg, saying he wanted to settle everything once and for all. He chose a remote location, a cabin in the mountains he used to escape from the world. Sarah arrived first, nervous and anxious. Greg showed up shortly after, guilt evident in his eyes. Ethan made them sit at the table, serving coffee as if it were a normal meeting. "We're here to resolve everything. Sarah, you have a lot to explain, and Greg, so do you. Sarah began to speak, trying to justify her actions, but Ethan interrupted. I don't want excuses. I want the truth. Greg, unable to keep the secret any longer, began to talk. Sarah, we need to tell him. He needs to know the truth. Sarah looked at Greg, confused and scared. What are you talking about? Ethan smiled, knowing the moment he had been waiting for was about to happen. He gave Greg a look that pressured him to confess, and finally, he broke down. Sarah, Ethan knows about your psychological disorder. He read your diary. He knows you were self-destructive, and I was just trying to help. Sarah remained silent, shocked. Ethan seized the moment to reveal his plan. Sarah, I know everything. I know about your inner struggles, your self-destructive behaviors. But you're not alone. Greg was there for you, but in the wrong way. And now, you're both going to pay for everything. The silence that followed was only broken by the sound of rain outside. Sarah began to cry, realizing the extent of the betrayal. Greg, ashamed, couldn't look at either of them. Ethan stood up, satisfied. You destroyed my life, and now I've destroyed yours. I hope you understand what it's like to feel this pain. With those words, he left the cabin, leaving Sarah and Greg to face the consequences of their actions. The revenge was complete, but the emptiness inside Ethan remained, now filled with a coldness he never imagined he possessed. Ethan drove down the mountain, feeling a mix of satisfaction and emptiness. The revenge he had meticulously planned was complete, but the sense of triumph was bitter. He drove home, the sound of rain on the car roof drowning out his thoughts. When he got home, the loneliness engulfed him once more. The memories of Sarah and Greg haunted him, but he knew there was no going back. He had crossed a line, and now he had to deal with the consequences of his own actions. The next day, Ethan went to the office, trying to resume normalcy. His colleagues noticed the change in his behavior, but no one dared to ask. Ethan buried himself in work, using it as a distraction. However, the peace he sought didn't last long. Greg, unable to cope with the guilt and pressure of keeping the secret, made a drastic decision. A week after the confrontation at the cabin, Ethan received a call from Greg's wife, Emily. Ethan, it's Greg. He tried to commit suicide. He's in the hospital, in critical condition. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He knew his revenge had had a devastating impact, but he didn't imagine Greg would go that far. He felt guilty, but the coldness he had cultivated prevented him from showing it. At the hospital, he found Emily crying in the hallway. Greg was in a coma, and the doctors didn't know if he would survive. Emily, unaware of the complexity of the situation, blamed Ethan. You were his best friend. How could you let him get to this point? Ethan had no answer. Her words echoed in his mind, but he knew he couldn't reveal the truth. The guilt consumed him, but he hid it behind a mask of indifference. Meanwhile, Sarah was also dealing with the fallout. She had lost her job, her friends, and now she knew that Ethan knew her deepest secrets. She felt exposed and vulnerable, not knowing whom to trust. In a desperate attempt to find redemption, she sought professional help. Dr. Anderson, the psychologist Ethan had consulted, was now treating Sarah. She began opening up about her feelings and fears, trying to rebuild her life. During the sessions, she realized she needed to face Ethan to close this chapter of her life. A month after the incident at the cabin, Sarah decided to confront Ethan. She called him, asking to meet at a park they used to frequent when they were happy. Ethan, curious about what she had to say, agreed to the meeting. In the park, the serene setting contrasted with the tension between them. Sarah began to speak, her voice firm despite her nervousness. Ethan, I know you read my diary. I know you know about my problems. But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm seeking help. And I know what I did was wrong, but I want to understand why you did what you did." For the first time, Ethan felt vulnerable. The coldness that had guided him up to that point began to melt away in the face of Sarah's honesty. He took a deep breath and decided to open up as well. "Sarah, when I found out about your betrayal, it felt like my world was falling apart. I didn't know what to do, and the pain turned into anger. I wanted you and Greg to feel what I felt. I wanted revenge. But now, seeing where it has led us, I don't know if it was worth it." Sarah nodded, understanding Ethan's pain. "We both made mistakes. I, for betraying your trust, and you, for seeking revenge. But we need to move forward. I want to start over, without this weight on our shoulders." Ethan looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He knew he needed to do the same, to let go of the past and move on. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to stop looking back and start rebuilding." They talked for hours, sharing feelings they had kept hidden for so long. Ethan realized that revenge hadn't brought the peace he had hoped for. Sarah, in turn, began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. As the sun set, marking the end of a painful chapter, Ethan and Sarah decided to go their separate ways, but without the burden of revenge or guilt. They knew the road to recovery would be long, but they were willing to try. Ethan returned home, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in months. He knew he still had a lot of work to do to redeem himself, but that meeting with Sarah was an important step. He decided to visit Greg in the hospital, hoping that, somehow, he could help repair the damage he had caused. At the hospital, Ethan found Emily by Greg's side, holding his hand. He approached, feeling the tension in the air. "Emily, I'm so sorry. I never wanted things to get to this point." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I know, Ethan. I know you were hurting. But we need to focus on helping Greg recover." Ethan nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew the journey to redemption would be long, but he was ready to face it step by step. The revenge had consumed his life, but now he sought to rebuild, piece by piece, the person he once was. And so, as the rain finally stopped and the sun began to shine, Ethan took the first step toward leaving the past behind and finding a new path, where revenge no longer dictated his actions, but rather the search for peace and redemption. The weeks following Ethan's meeting with Sarah and his visit to Greg in the hospital were filled with introspection and change. The journey of revenge he had embarked on consumed him, but now, he was determined to seek redemption, one step at a time.